Some of the greatest cars ever built were never sold to the public. One sat locked in a government warehouse for 13 years, even though Bill Gates owned it. One was so fast that a gang of thieves used it to outrun the police. One was cleared of fraud in court on every single charge, but by then the company was already gone, its cars sold off for pennies. These are real cars, built, driven, and then taken away from us. So, let's begin the countdown at number 10, with a machine whose entire legend rests on a top speed that was never real. In 2003, Dodge rolled a thing onto the stage at the Detroit Auto Show that looked like a motorcycle designed by a fighter jet. Bolted into the middle of it was the 8.3-liter V10 out of the Viper. 500 horsepower, 4 wheels, close together in pairs, so it technically wasn't a motorcycle at all. And Dodge put a number on it that went around the world. A top speed of up to 420 miles an hour. 420. That would make a $250,000 novelty the fastest vehicle on Earth. Faster than a Formula One car. Faster than most small planes. Here's where the honesty starts. That number was never real. It came from a napkin, not a track. Take the horsepower, take the gearing, ignore the small detail that air exists, and the math spits out 400. A writer at Motorcyclist did the actual sum, and found you'd need around 700 horsepower just to reach 300, and the Tomahawk had 500. A land speed record holder pointed out the rider would be peeled off the seat by wind long before 200. So, did anyone ever test it? No. And that is the real story. Dodge's own chief operating officer admitted nobody had ever ridden it past 100 miles an hour. The one time it ran in public, at the Goodwood Hill Climb, it managed maybe 70. Dodge turned down every offer to prove the top speed, refused to even put it on a dyno, and quietly sold 9 of them through the Neiman Marcus Christmas catalog for $555,000 each, clearly labeled, in the company's own words, as sculpture that cannot legally be driven on the road. The fastest motorcycle ever built, and its real top speed is still, to this day, a rumor. Quick word before we go on, because you'll notice some famous names are missing from this list, and that's on purpose. The nuclear-powered Ford Nucleon everyone calls banned. It was never a car. It was a plastic model on a table, shelved because nobody could shrink a reactor to fit under a trunk lid. Those secret self-driving jet cars, GM supposedly buried, GM showed them off in public, on stage, at its own auto shows. The suppressed 100-mile-per-gallon Volkswagen, the chairman drove it to a shareholder meeting himself, and the company later put a version on sale. Those aren't banned cars, they're just good stories. The 10 on this list are the real thing. If the Tomahawk's speed was pure fantasy, our 9th car had the opposite problem. Its speed was terrifyingly real. Picture a 4-door family sedan, the kind of car that should have a child seat in the back and shopping in the boot. Now, picture it as the fastest 4-door on the planet. In 1990, Vauxhall handed its ordinary Carlton saloon to Lotus, and Lotus did something unreasonable to it. A twin-turbo straight-six, 377 horsepower, a top speed of 176 miles an hour, using the same gearbox as the Corvette ZR1. At the time, the German makers had just agreed among themselves to limit their fast cars to 155. Lotus and Vauxhall looked at that agreement and shipped this thing with no limiter at all for £48,000. Britain lost its mind. The Daily Mail ran a campaign to have it banned. The police called it, and I'm quoting, an outrageous invitation to speed. And on the 16th of November, 1990, it happened in Parliament. A member stood up in the House of Commons and attacked the car by name, warning about a Vauxhall that could do 170 miles an hour. Another said, driving it safely would require the skill of Formula One champion Nigel Mansell. And then reality wrote a better ending than any of them wanted. A gang stole one, registration 40RA, ramming it off a man's driveway in the middle of the night with a stolen Ford. For 6 weeks they used it for ram raids, smashing into shops for cigarettes and booze, and the police could not catch it. Their patrol cars topped out around 90. The Carlton could vanish onto the motorway at 160. At one point, the gang reversed it into a shop directly across from a police station because they knew nothing there could touch them. Parliament wanted it gone, and so did the Daily Mail. but neither of them managed it. What actually killed the Carlton was the recession. The car cost a fortune in a slump, and when Vauxhall stopped building it, only about 286 people in Britain had actually bought one. The Carlton was too fast for the people who write the rules. Our eighth car was too advanced for them. In the 1980s, Porsche built what was, by a distance, the most advanced car in the world. Twin turbochargers that switched in one after the other, a computer deciding how to split the power between all four wheels, and a top speed just under 200 miles an hour when a Ferrari of the day struggled to reach 180. Only 292 of them were made, and you could not have one in America, not legally, not at any price. Now, the story you usually hear is that Porsche refused to hand over 4 cars to be smashed in government crash tests. That's a myth. The American government doesn't crash test cars itself, the manufacturer certifies them. So there was never a stack of cars for Porsche to refuse. The truth is quieter and stranger. Porsche only ever built the 959 to European rules, and did the math on making an American legal version. They were already losing money on every single car at $250,000, and federalizing it would have added something like $200,000 of loss per car. So, they simply never did it. The 959 was never banned. It was just never allowed in, which led to one of the great rich man stories in car history. Bill Gates, then close to the richest man alive, bought a 959, and U.S. Customs seized it at the border. It sat in a bonded warehouse for roughly 13 years, with Gates reportedly paying a $28 a day storage fee the entire time, unable to drive a car he owned outright. Paul Allen, his Microsoft co-founder, had his seized too. It took an act of Congress to free them. Gates and others lobbied for years, and in 1999, a new federal rule called Show or Display finally let cars like the 959 in, as long as you drove them under 2,500 miles a year. The richest man in the world, and for 13 years, he could not touch his own car. Bill Gates at least got his car back in the end. The owners of our 7th car were not so lucky, because this is the one the whole title promises. Not a car that was canceled, or quietly killed, or lost to politics. A car the United States government physically seized and crushed. Nissan never sold the Skyline GT-R new in America. The R32, the R33, the R34, the cars a whole generation fell in love with through video games and the Fast and Furious films. None of them were legal here, because Nissan never built them to American standards, and a 1988 law made it illegal to import a car younger than 25 years that didn't comply. There was one narrow door. A registered importer could bring cars in if it paid to crash test them and prove they were safe. A company called Motorex walked through that door, and then propped it open with a lie. Motorex actually did crash test one model, the R33, and got it approved. Then it started bringing in R32s and R34s too, claiming their crash data was identical to the R33s. It wasn't. Only the R33 had ever been tested. When the government worked that out, it revoked Motorex's license in 2006 and slammed the door on every Skyline that wasn't an R33. And then it got serious. In 2009, federal agents raided an importer with guns drawn and hauled cars away. The government seized illegally imported Skylines and, in documented cases, ordered them destroyed. One enthusiast had a 1995 and a 1996 Skyline taken. The government refused to even let him ship them back overseas and insisted they be scrapped. Here's the myth I promised to bust, though. People love to say the government crushed Paul Walker's actual Fast and Furious R34. It didn't. That specific hero car was impounded, then released, then exported to Germany, where it survives. A different Skyline got the crusher. The legend mashed 2 cars into one. And the cruel joke is what those cars are worth now that they're finally allowed in. A clean R34 GTR sells for well over $300,000, and the rarest version ever built, the Nismo Z-Tune, sold for nearly $2 million. America spent years crushing a car that turned out to be one of the most valuable Japanese cars in history. They couldn't ban the car, so in the end they banned the calendar. The R34 only became legal to bring in starting in January 2024, when the first ones finally turned 25 years old. The skyline was destroyed by the law. Our sixth car was destroyed by something with no legal power at all: 11 minutes of television. On the 23rd of November, 1986, the CBS news program 60 Minutes ran a segment on the Audi 5000. It claimed the car suffered from sudden unintended acceleration, that it would lunge forward on its own with the driver standing on the brake. And to show it, they ran footage of an Audi's engine revving and the car surging forward, apparently possessed. What the millions of people watching at home were not told is what was sitting on the passenger floor, just out of frame: a canister of compressed air, connected by a hose to a hole that had been drilled into the car's transmission. The man who built that rig was a paid expert witness for people who were, at that very moment, suing Audi. The car did not accelerate on its own. It was pumped full of air until it did. The most heartbreaking story in the segment was a mother whose car surged and killed her own 6-year-old son. On camera, she said her foot was on the brake. The police report, which the program never mentioned, said her foot had slipped off the brake onto the gas. 3 years later, the American Highway Safety Agency studied it and reached the obvious conclusion: the cars were fine and people were pressing the wrong pedal, not helped by Audi's European pedals being closer together than Americans were used to. But by then it was over. Audi's American sales had collapsed by 83%. The company nearly left the country entirely, and it took 15 years to climb back. 60 Minutes never retracted a word. But here's the strange gift buried in the wreckage. To calm the panic, Audi added a feature that forced you to press the brake before you could shift out of park. It worked so well that regulators made everyone copy it. That little lock is in almost every automatic car on Earth now, including yours. The scare was fake. The safety device it forced into existence is real, and it's protecting you every time you start your car. After all that, we could use something wonderful. And our fifth car is the one I've been waiting to get back to. The jet-powered machine from the very start of this story. In 1963, Chrysler built a car with a jet engine. Not a jet-style car, an actual gas turbine, the kind of engine in a helicopter, spinning up to 36,000 revolutions a minute under a beautiful bronze body built in Italy. It made instant torque, had 80% fewer moving parts than a normal engine, and would run on almost anything you poured in. Diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, even perfume or peanut oil. When Chrysler took one to Mexico, the president asked if it could run on tequila. Chrysler's engineers tested it overnight to be sure, then let his car run on 80-proof tequila. And here's the part that makes it human. Chrysler didn't hide this thing in a lab. It ran a giant public trial. It handed the keys to 203 ordinary American families, chosen from across the country, one after another, 90 days each, completely free. A school teacher, a farmer, a housewife, each given a jet-powered car for 3 months. Regular people drove it to work and to the grocery store, and together they put more than 1 million miles on the fleet, and most of them fell in love. Then Chrysler took 46 of the 55 cars and burned and crushed them. The story you'll hear is that they did it to dodge a massive import tax on the Italian bodies. Not true. The duty worked out to around $500 a car, pocket change against a program that cost millions. The real reasons were dull and human. These were hand-built prototypes Chrysler couldn't service or supply parts for, and in the company's own words, they did not want turbine cars turning up on used car lots where they couldn't control them. The turbine dream itself finally died in 1979, beaten by the fuel it couldn't clean up and the exotic metals it couldn't afford, right as the company nearly went bankrupt. 9 cars survive. Jay Leno owns one, and he still drives it. One of the most loved cars Chrysler ever built, and they set most of them on fire. Chrysler burned its jet cars to keep control of them. The car at number 4 was destroyed just as completely, and it never took a single flame. All it took was one book. In 1965, a young lawyer named Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, and its first chapter turned one car into a national symbol of death: the Chevrolet Corvair. The early Corvair had an unusual rear suspension that could misbehave badly in hard corners, and Nader's book made Corvair mean death trap in the American mind. There are 2 twists here, and both matter. The first is that General Motors had already killed the Corvair before the book landed, not because of safety, but because the Ford Mustang had come out the year before and eaten the Corvair's market alive. GM quietly stopped developing it in April 1965, 7 months before Nader's first chapter was even printed. It kept building the car on life support, partly because canceling it outright, with 100 lawsuits pending, would have looked like an admission of guilt. The sales tell the story. Nearly 250,000 in 1965, then half that, then a third of that, until the last one trickled out in 1969. The second twist is what GM did to Nader. Rattled by this one lawyer, the largest company in the world hired private detectives to follow him, dig into his private life, question his friends about his politics and his sex life, and, he alleged, try to lure him into compromising situations with women. It backfired spectacularly. GM's own president was hauled before the United States Senate and forced to apologize to Nader to his face. Nader sued for invasion of privacy, won $425,000, and used General Motors' own money to found the consumer watchdog groups that would police Detroit for the next 50 years. And the car? In 1972, the government finally ran the tests. The verdict? The Corvair handled at least as well as other cars of its day, better than a VW Beetle. It was cleared, 3 years after the last one had already been built. Innocent, and nobody was left to tell. Every car so far was brought down by something enormous: a government, a corporation, a media firestorm. Number 3 was killed by nothing bigger than a single wounded ego. It was never sold, never crushed, never banned by any government. And you have absolutely heard of what it turned into. In 1967, a brilliant rover engineer named Spen King built a secret car almost in his spare time, testing it at night to keep it quiet. It was a mid-engine V8 sports car, low and beautiful, with a clever trick. He'd shoved the engine to one side so he could fit a third seat, in a car shorter than the family saloon it was based on. Rover claimed it would do 0 to 60 in 7 seconds and reach 140. That was Ferrari pace, from the company your granddad bought his sensible saloon from. Then the British car industry merged itself into one giant company, and overnight, Rover found itself under the same roof as Jaguar. And by every account that's come down to us, the founder of Jaguar, Sir William Lyons, took one look at this in-house sports car that could outrun his own E-Type, and made sure it never saw a showroom. If those accounts are right, it wasn't beaten on merit. It was strangled by a rival who couldn't stand the competition. Just one prototype was ever built, and it sits in a British museum today, the great lost sports car that never was. Except, Spen King didn't stop. He took everything he'd learned and poured it into his next project. And in 1970, the very year his sports car finally died for good, that next project launched. It was the Range Rover. The car they killed became the man's masterpiece anyway, wearing a completely different shape, and it went on to change the world. Spen King got a second act. Our runner-up never did. In 1947, a man named Preston Tucker unveiled a car so far ahead of Detroit, it looked like it came from another decade, and it sold itself on the one thing almost nobody else in the industry was willing to talk about: keeping you alive. A padded dashboard, and a footwell you could dive into in a crash. A windshield designed to pop out instead of shredding you. A third headlight in the center that turned with the steering to light up the corner. He built it in an old Chicago plant that had made engines for B-29 bombers during the war, the largest factory building in the world. Detroit did not want this car to exist. And to be honest with you, we can't prove they conspired to kill it, though the rumor has never died. What we can prove is what actually brought Tucker down. He'd funded the company in unusual ways, pre-selling dealerships and accessories for a car that didn't exist yet. In 1948, the securities regulators opened an investigation into whether that was legal. And then a famous radio columnist told the entire nation the government was about to, in his words, blow Tucker higher than a kite. The stock collapsed, the money dried up. 1,600 workers went home, and the factory doors closed. Tucker went to trial for fraud. And at that trial, the government's own witness accidentally destroyed the government's case, admitting his Tucker had 35,000 miles on it and still cruised smoothly at 90. In January 1950, the jury acquitted Preston Tucker and all his associates on every one of 31 counts. He won, and it didn't matter. By the time the jury said not guilty, the company was already gone, its assets sold off for pennies, all 51 cars scattered. Preston Tucker died of cancer 6 years later, at 53. His dream already history. Those 51 fraud cars now sell for close to $3 million each. He was found innocent of building a car too good to be allowed, and by the time anyone said so, there was nothing left to save. Which brings us at last to number 1, and to the one that still stings the most, because this time it happened in an age that should have known better. In 1996, General Motors built a real mass-produced electric car, and the people who drove it fell in love. It was quick, silent, cost almost nothing to run, and by its second generation, it could go 100 miles or more on a charge in the 1990s. It was the only car GM ever badged simply General Motors, like the company was signing its name to the future. You couldn't buy one. GM would only lease them. And a few years later, GM ended the program, called in every single car, and refused to let anyone keep theirs at any price. Why is where it gets ugly. California had a rule forcing car makers to sell zero-emission cars, which is the whole reason the EV1 existed. GM sued California to kill that rule, and won. And the moment the rule was dead, so was the car it had forced into being. GM said the numbers never worked, that it lost money on everyone. Critics said GM never wanted it to succeed in the first place. What isn't in dispute is what happened next. The drivers begged to keep their cars. A group of them raised $1.9 million in about 2 days to buy the last 78, with GM's liability signed away. GM said no. It hauled the cars to a proving ground in the Arizona desert and crushed them. Drivers held a funeral vigil. One actress was arrested lying down in front of the car carriers. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, simply hid his, so they couldn't take it. And here's the timing. In 2003, the same year GM began calling in the EV1s to be destroyed, a small company was founded by people who pointed at those doomed cars as their whole reason for existing. It was called Tesla. GM's own chief executive later admitted that killing the EV1 was the worst decision he ever made. They crushed the future in the desert and then spent the next 20 years and billions of dollars trying to build it all over again. And here is the ending. GM never planned. One EV1 slipped through. It sat forgotten in a university parking garage for 2 decades, was hauled off to an impound auction in 2025, and sold for $104,000, the only one ever legally sold to the public. Right now, it's being restored to run, with General Motors quietly helping, aimed at the car's 30th birthday. The future they crushed in the desert refused to stay dead. And that's the thread running through all 10 of these. Almost none of them were banned by some shadowy hand. They were killed by lawyers and accountants, by a rival's pride, by 11 minutes of television, by a recession, by a calendar. That's the real history of the car. Not just the machines they built, but the ones somebody decided you were better off never driving. If you want to see a car that actually got finished, the last Mercedes the engineers were allowed to build exactly the way they wanted before the accountants took over. That story is waiting for you right here.